other speaker tonight is writer Mike Soto. And Mike is a first-generation Mexican-American raised in East Dallas and in a small town in Michoacan. He's the author of the chapbooks Beyond the Shadows, Inc. and Dallas Spleen, and most recently a debut collection of poetry entitled A Grave is Given Supper, which was recently adapted to the stage by Teatro Dallas. I'm just going to bring Mike to the stage as I say something in his own words. So in his own words, about A Grave is Given Supper, Mike says, feeling distant, far from family and the place that has given me the deepest sense of home, I resolved to write about individuals on a journey of self-actualization despite living in such a climate of violence. But I wanted to take that further and make it a quest for a kind of enlightenment. Ladies and gentlemen, Mike Soto.
Woo!
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Erin. Thank you to House of Speakeasy and Serious Entertainment for having me. So when I heard tonight's theme was what it was going to be, I immediately thought of the vast network of plans all over the world, unfortunately, that the pandemic made vanish. Instead of a literal worldwide web of connections, we've been forced to feel the negative space of all those connections that have failed to happen because of COVID-19. So many daily interactions with people we see every day vanished. So many plans postponed. So many hopes that never got the chance to materialize. I'm sure you can agree that we've been made to feel that void, that negative space. So much of our daily connectivity go up in smoke. So since the pandemic has settled deeply into our lives, I've been trying to refuse nostalgia. Refusing to go back in time with any spark of imagination. I think the lure of nostalgia has captured many of us. I felt the lure of looking back in conversation with friends and family and their posts on social media, which have become increasingly nostalgic. And don't get me wrong, it's beautiful to see the memories of people you love. That is the lure of looking back. There's such a beautiful and safe place to roam, especially when the present is so difficult to accept on so many levels. When the present state of the world has felt too immense to bear and for this long. But something very simple that the late Ram Dass once said hasn't left me alone. Who you think you are can't handle it, can't bear it. Who you are can. The idea being that who we are behind all our individual ambitions and distinctions, there's a vaster interconnected self with a shared ground even with people we clash with or think of as opponents. And who we really are can not only bear it, we were somehow made to bear it. And it seemed to me that if we sidestep the realities of the pandemic, which includes our present political climate, institutional racism, and the blind exploitation of our natural resources, all of which COVID-19 has laid painfully bare, we would also be sidestepping our ability to respond completely. If we shelter ourselves from these realities, avoid experiencing them, and choose to escape, we're also truncating our ability to respond and to heal. It's natural during these times to reach for metaphors like light at the end of the tunnel, perhaps out of necessity. This metaphor has become ubiquitous in our social spheres. As we know, these generalized metaphors are only doorways. These metaphors tend to ring hollow for their failure to reach us in a particular or personal way. They point to archetypal realms, archetypal narratives. Where these metaphors meet personal experience, that's where the real light is. Those are the moments that give us hope that we can continually draw from. In resisting the urge to look back on brighter times, perhaps I felt I should find brightness in the here and now. But in my refusal of nostalgia, it seems like what I've been doing instead is coaxing a particular moment and memory to the surface. It being November, I can't help but think about the trip I've taken between 2014 to 2018 to Michoacan for Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. I have a small and dear group of friends who know where to go and have relationships with indigenous communities that dot the area around Lago Pátzcuaro in Michoacan. Over the course of these years, we visited the homes of families who were mourning loved ones who had passed away that same year. The doorways of those houses would be lined with marigolds, indicating an open invitation to enter a pozole, a purepecha version of tamales called nacatamales, along with café de olla, black coffee sweetened with molasses and cinnamon, or hot punch spiked with tequila, at the ofrenda, or altar, and join with families on their night of collective remembering. The creation of an ofrenda dedicated to the recently deceased is at the core of this tradition. And in this region, the creation of the ofrenda involves an intimate grammar of arranging a cornucopia of marigolds, guavas, bananas, oranges, and apples, cobs of maize, along with a candle flame with tapers and bread baked in adobe brick ovens, in a framework that puts the one who has died in the center of an earthy abundance stripped to its basics. Besides the picture of the loved one, there are no images, no iconography, no skeletons or candy skulls. I started going on this journey with the intention to see the Dia de los Muertos from top to bottom, from the most generalized form, which manifests itself in an Americanized hybrid with Halloween, all the way down to the indigenous rituals of the Day of the Dead, which interested me the most. I was writing my first book of poetry, The Greatest Given Supper, which was published this year, and it felt important for me to experience all of it. It was also a deeply personal trip, as my family is from Michoacan, and for most of my life, I had no idea the most iconic images and rituals of the Day of the Dead originated in a place I called home. But in the years preceding this, the drug war made Michoacan occupied territory for tide after tide of violence between the drug cartels and also between the cartels and the military. The potential for violence changes the temperature of everything, changes the tense in which you experience the world. It makes you imagine trauma and your own demise constantly, but too often those fears are actualized. During these years, precious few of us in the Mexican and the Mexican American community are not directly or indirectly affected by the sinister turn in violence. Indigenous communities in Michoacan were particularly vulnerable, and it was not uncommon to pin murder on members of the Purepecha community when a scapegoat was needed. Every year during these nights in November, we stayed up until dawn, visiting roadside cemeteries, cemeteries of towns, cemeteries accessible only by ferry, all of which would be teeming with candle flame and marigolds, and the ofrendas inside homes. We went to towns that gladly opened their cemeteries to the public, and towns that deliberately began their rituals at 3 a.m. to avoid tourists. On one fateful night, on the last year I came to Michoacan, we journeyed to the outside town where we were told the family was welcoming guests. This was in a more rural area where the fields of maize and the boulder fences, with the fields of maize and the boulder fences that are so typical of rural Michoacan. But when we arrived at the house, things were different than we expected. People were dancing. There was a live band. And what's more, most, if not all, the people present seemed like adolescents. To give you some context as to why this felt odd, in all the cemeteries and homes that we visited those 4 years, none of them played music, no one danced. There was silence, a silence for remembering, silence at a conversation with families. Usually the most active members of the family would be the elders, the matriarch or the patriarch of the family, leading prayers, telling stories of their loved one, or traditional Purepecha stories. But what sealed our uneasiness in this particular instance was not just that everyone seemed like teenagers dressed up as adults, but that they were also mourning the loss of an infant. The centerpiece of the ofrenda was a picture of a child, framed by a fluorescent string of lights, and we recognized what had to be the mother and father, very small in stature, every bit as young as everyone else. There's no better way to say this except to give you my personal take. It seemed like this was a distorted version of the Day of the Dead that we had found, not only off the beaten path, but on a path even farther out. A crossroads where this tradition met the dark ethos of what the drug war had done to Michoacan, which was to abbreviate the childhood of children, rob the young of their youth, to a degree that it becomes a distant core, a distant light in the formation of a person. But the reason I'm telling you this is not to shock you or to paint a bleak picture. It's to tell you of the flip side of what came right after we left. Admittedly, we did not stay long. My two friends and I, Laura and Luz, exchanged glances and made our way out. When we left and had put that house at a distance behind us, we exchanged a few words that corroborated what we were feeling. What we had seen disturbed all of us, and it was not easy to shake or understand what we had seen. Only the depth of the disturbance was real. The lights of the town were at a distance in front of us, and the light of that house behind us. We made our way back to the car, each of us downcast in a sobering silence. Then came the moment when I picked up my head and saw an astonishing sight. A white horse standing directly under a full moon, grazing on the grass. I would later say that it was a light horse, because one of the first descriptions that came to my mind is that it seemed as if the moon had poured the horse down onto the earth. That moon and that horse were one and the same. The moon like a stage that the horse stepped down from because it was hungry, and there it was, grazing the grass. I nudged Luz without saying a word and watched her eyes widen the way my eyes must have widened. There was an impossible intimacy to this moment. As much as I've been refusing nostalgia during the pandemic, this is the moment that came back to me, despite my refusal. But even though this moment felt like an absolute gift, it's inextricable from what we experienced just before. And I can never forget our visit to that house and that ofrenda, the altar to that child. There was a moment of going acutely beyond the conventions of language as well, as my light at the end of the tunnel was this horse, staged in a moment of crystal clear recognition, tearing the moonlit grass from the ground and chewing it wetly in its mouth, staring right at us. Thank you.